afternoon.
Good morning, my lady. I'll call, please, Tamsin Mullen, who can be sworn.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
the truth.
Ms. Mullen, I know how distressing this is going to be for you, but please just remember that we're all here to try and help you through it, and we'll get you through it as quickly as we can, and it won't be pain-free as we can make it. All right?
Thank you.
Can you give your full name, please?
Tamsin Mullen.
Now, Miss Mullen, you've kindly provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated June 2024. That's INQ 000485735. And I think you've got a copy of that witness statement in front of you. Is that right?
Yes.
Mrs. Mullen, I think it's right that you're married with 3 children.
Yes.
You have a daughter who's now 9 years old and twin boys aged 4. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think your twin boys were born in the relatively early days of the pandemic on the 13th of April 2020, and they spent 31 days in a neonatal unit before being discharged home. And you're here today to give evidence about your and your husband's experiences of antenatal and maternity care at that time, as well as your experiences as parents visiting babies on that neonatal unit. Mrs. Mullen, I think it's right that you found out at 8 weeks that you were pregnant with twins. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were considered to be a high-risk pregnancy due to having experienced pre-eclampsia when you were pregnant with your first child. Is that right?
Yes.
And also, I think your daughter had suffered from intrauterine growth restriction. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because of all those factors, I think the pregnancy was monitored quite closely, and you were having scans initially every 2 weeks. Is that right?
Yes.
And then I think there came a point where that changed to weekly scans because there were some concerns about the growth of one of the babies. Is that correct?
Yes.
When you were having those scans, how far away was the hospital from where you lived?
It was around 50 miles. It was about a 45-minute journey.
So every time you had to go for a weekly scan, it was a 1.5-hour round trip. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think initially your husband was able to come to the scan appointments with you. Is that correct?
Yes.
But then I think there came a point where that changed because of coronavirus rules.
Yes.
And can you remember when it was that the rules changed about your husband being able to accompany you?
It was shortly before the first lockdown came into effect.
So in March of 2020?
Yes.
Thank you. And so when Shane your husband was no longer able to attend the scans with you, were you travelling to the hospital by yourself, or was he bringing you to the hospital?
He was still bringing me.
And so where would he be when you were going in for the scan?
In the car.
And how did that affect you when you were going into the scans on your own?
I was very nervous. It was really difficult to do that alone, knowing about the high risk part.
And did you speak to your husband about how it was impacting him to have to wait in the car while you were having the scans?
Yeah, he supports me 100% in everything, so having to be separated during that time that I really, really needed the support was really distressing for him to have to do.
I think you've explained in your witness statement that he felt excluded and as if the healthcare system was saying that he didn't matter. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. I think the babies were monitored, as you said, weekly with scans. And on Friday, the 10th of April, you were told that the babies need to be delivered by caesarean section in the next 5 days. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you were booked in then for that procedure to take place the following Monday, the 13th of April. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the twins then were 34 weeks gestation. Is that correct?
Yes.
When it came to finding out that the babies were due to be delivered the following Monday, was Shane with you at that point, or were you on your own in the hospital when you were informed?
I was on my own then.
And when you went to the hospital for the caesarean delivery, was your husband allowed to come in with you at that point?
Yes.
So I think you arrived quite early in the morning for that caesarean section to take place. And in fact, the boys were delivered, I think, in the early afternoon. Is that correct?
Yes.
And was your husband able to be with you throughout that period of time when you were waiting?
Yes.
And was he able to come into the operating theatre with you?
Yes.
Either when you were waiting or when you went into the operating theatre, can you recall whether you were provided with or asked to wear any kind of masks or personal protective equipment?
No, we can't recall any point of that at all.
So it wasn't something that was discussed with you at all?
No.
Do you remember whether the medical staff and the nursing staff were wearing anything, any PPE?
I can't remember about the maternity unit staff, but others, later on, the neonatal staff were. I can't remember about the maternity staff.
Right. I think in your witness statement, you recalled that your husband had decided to wear some PPE, but he hadn't been asked to do so. Is that right?
He wore like the sort of the hospital gave him scrubs to wear and things, so he would wear that. But masks wise, there was nothing.
Thank you. I think once your twins were born, they were taken very quickly to the neonatal intensive care unit. I think there was an opportunity. I think your husband had been able to cut the umbilical cords. Is that right?
Yes.
And only had a chance to take a photograph of one of the boys before they were both taken away.
Yes.
Once the babies had been taken to the neonatal intensive care unit, was your husband able to stay with you?
He was able to stay with me while I was in recovery only, and then he was told to leave.
Do you know how long he was allowed to stay with you for?
About an hour.
Thank you. And so then he was told to leave. Was that because of coronavirus rules?
Yeah.
So once your husband had left you, did you have an opportunity to see the babies again?
I was wheeled down to the neonatal unit to see them, and then before going to the antenatal ward.
And how long did you have with the babies at that point when you were wheeled down to the unit?
I can't recall exactly, but not very long. It wasn't very long.
And then you were taken down to, I think, a postnatal side room. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So were you on your own in that room?
Yes.
And was Shane your husband allowed to come into the room with you?
No.
And how often did you see nurses or healthcare assistants while you were in that side room on your own?
Every so often, just to sort of check in on me or give me medication, or if I called them on the buzzer.
In that first day or two after the twins had been born, how was communication from the neonatal unit where they were being looked after? Were you given regular updates on their progress?
No.
I think in large part because of that, you were keen to be discharged as soon as possible so that you were able to see your boys and your husband and indeed your daughter who was at home. Is that right?
Yes.
I think in total you spent 27 hours in the side room before you were discharged. Is that correct?
Yes.
Once you'd been then discharged from postnatal care, I think you explained in your witness statement you and your husband then encountered the rigid visiting rules for the neonatal intensive care unit. I think the rules at that point were that only one parent was permitted to visit at a time. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that wasn't interpreted as one parent per baby. So your twins were you could only see your twins one at a time. Is that correct?
Yes.
So how were you managing the visits then between yourself and your husband at that period? You were travelling over from your home 45 minutes. How did an average day work out for the two of you?
Average day was leave home for the journey, get to the hospital, and we'd sort of decide who would go into the unit first. And one of us would wait in the waiting room just outside of the unit. And we'd spend a couple of hours like that, and then we'd swap over for a couple of hours and then go home because we had our daughter at home who we also wanted to see. So then we'd travel home after that time.
I think your parents were looking after your daughter at that point, is that right?
Yes.
And she was not at school because of the lockdown?
Yes.
So you would go in for 2 hours whilst your husband waited in the waiting room. Were there other parents in the waiting room at that time?
There were sometimes, yes. Yeah, there were other people as well coming and going. There was always people coming and going.
And were parents visiting babies on the neonatal unit being asked to wear masks or any other kind of PPE at that time?
No.
I think on a number of occasions you questioned that visiting policy as to why the two of you couldn't go in together, as you had come from the same household and travelled to the hospital in the same car and were going to travel back together. What was the response whenever you questioned those rules?
It was the nurses responded in that they didn't understand why either, and the matron her hands were tied because the rules came from higher up. I'm not quite sure where she said, but the rules came from higher up, so her hands were tied, so she couldn't do anything to change anything or to help that matter.
So the matron didn't seem to have any discretion to vary the rules herself or to have a conversation with someone in a position of authority to see if there could be any relaxation of the rules in your case?
It didn't seem so.
I think in that first week after the twins had been born, when you were on the unit visiting the boys, you were informed that they had been swabbed for MRSA and the results had come back, the initial results had come back positive. Is that right?
Yes.
So how were you informed about that?
I was alone on the unit, holding... Sorry. What?
Take your time. Have a sip of water, always helps.
Holding our son, who was on oxygen at the time. So sorry. A couple of people from the hospital, they were wearing black scrubs. I had never seen them before. They weren't from the unit. they had just come in and said that the provisional results for the boys were MRSA positive, and I was sort of in a state of shock, I think. So I didn't really say much, and they had just come in, told me that, and they said we'll get the final result tomorrow, and they just went, and I was just sort of there on my own, sort of thinking. I didn't know what that meant, and I just was really panicked, and like it just got worse and worse. And it was, for me, MRSA is a superbug. It kills people, and I had no idea what it meant for me, whether I was allowed to leave the room or anything. So yeah, at the time, it was awful because it was just, I had no information really at all, apart from they'd been swabbed. I had no idea they'd been swabbed. Shane had no idea either. And we were just, I just felt awful.
I think you were able to go and speak to your husband Shane in the waiting room to explain what you'd just been told. And I think he went to speak to a nurse or somebody to try to find out what was happening. Is that right?
Yes.
I think it wasn't until the following day that you were able to speak to a doctor who could explain that, in fact, there were two types of MRSA, and this was a less serious type of MRSA that colonised on the skin and could be treated with soap. Is that right?
Yes.
But I think prior to being given that reassuring information, you were very uncertain about whether you might be exposing the babies to further risk from germs or other kinds of infection if you were holding them. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I think at one point, your husband did once break the rules to come into the ward with you, to try to allay your fears about that, and so that you could be holding the babies together. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I think that was when you were asked to go and swab yourselves for the MRSA virus. Is that right?
Yes.
And when your husband came onto the unit with you on that occasion, did the nurses intervene? Did anyone object to that?
No, not at all.
After the twins had received that diagnosis of MRSA, they were then put into an isolation room, effectively. They were put into a room by themselves without any other babies. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were still able to visit them?
Yes.
At that point, was there any relaxation in the rules in terms of the two of you being able to visit at the same time?
No.
And did you raise that again, that now there were no other babies in the room with them, and would it be possible for the two of you to visit together?
Yes, we did, yeah.
And what was the response?
It was the same response. Hands are tied, couldn't do anything.
So, with the two babies there in the room and only one parent, what would happen if both babies started crying at the same time?
We would have to try and decide which one to see to first, because they were in separate incubators. So it was just a matter of maybe who cried first, and it was literally as simple as that. We just had to choose, and then go to one, and then go to the other one, and try and settle one while the other one's screaming, and very difficult.
You have set out in your witness statement that there was an occasion when you were in the room with your twins, when a counsellor came into the room to ask if you wanted any support, and you explained that you couldn't understand why another person was allowed into the isolation room with you when your husband and co-parent was not allowed. Did you raise that with anyone at the time?
I can't remember, to be honest, if we did raise that specific point, but it was it was one thing that baffled us.
At this period when you were coming in daily to visit the twins in hospital?
Yes.
And your daughter was at home 45 minutes away, being looked after by your parents. How was this impacting your daughter, because you were spending quite long periods of the day away from home?
She was 5 at the time. She couldn't understand why Mummy and Daddy were able to go to the hospital without her, and why we were away for so long. It would always be a question when we came back: when can I meet the boys? When can I come and see them with you? So she just couldn't understand it in her head, no matter how much we tried to explain it to her for her. She did start to become distressed, so we sort of had to change the way we did things a little bit. But yeah, she just couldn't understand.
And so you had to change your routine in visiting the twins to try to accommodate your daughter's needs as well.
Yeah.
And how did that work?
We went up first thing, and we would get up, drop her off at Mum and Dad's, go up to the hospital first thing in the morning, and then be back just after lunchtime to then homeschool her and be with her for the rest of the day. And
was your daughter permitted to visit the babies on the unit, or and was that made clear to you from the early days of the boys being on the unit?
Yes, yeah.
I think in the early time when the boys were on the unit, you were trying to express milk, or it was your intention to try to express milk for the twins. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you made a request whether it would be possible for you to have a private place or a side room where you could express the milk in the hospital. And that wasn't made available to you. Can you explain what happened there?
Excuse me. So I asked whether one of the side rooms that weren't being used on the unit could be used by me. I wasn't going to go down to where Shane was with the boys, just so I could express at the times I needed to. But it was no, you can't be on the unit, you can't use one of the rooms, and the suggestion was made to me to use one of the toilets, which I wasn't going to do because we all know the germs that can be found in toilets, and to take milk that's supposed to be sterile to poorly babies, tiny babies, it just wasn't, in my head, was not going to happen anyway. So I wasn't given the opportunity to do that.
And were you given any explanation for why you couldn't use a side room that appeared to be empty and available for use?
No, just it was just all down to the rules. Shane was on the unit, so I couldn't be.
Thank you. In terms of communication with the hospital at the time that the boys were on the neonatal intensive care unit, were you getting regular communications or updates when you were away from the hospital? Were you getting telephone calls or updates on their progress?
No.
And when you went in to the unit in the mornings, were you given any explanations for or updates about how the boys had been doing overnight, or were you left to check notes?
We were usually left to ask them how have they been, what has particular things been like. We were left to unless something particular happened overnight that they voiced to us, we would ask.
I think there were occasions when you noted there had been some changes made to, for example, the feeding routines when the twins were being bottle fed to try to get them ready for being discharged from the unit. And you'd noticed that overnight they had been fed by nasogastric tube. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that something that you discussed and tried to find out why that had taken place?
We asked the nurses on the unit, but they didn't know either because we were trying the bottle feeding and they all knew we were trying that. They also couldn't understand.
I think you later explained that once the boys had been discharged and you were given the discharge notes, you found some other aspects of their care or indeed their condition that hadn't been explained to you at the time, and that in fact you found out on reading the discharge notes that one of the boys had chronic lung disease. Is that right?
Yes.
And that wasn't anything that had been brought to your attention or discussed with you while they're on the unit?
No.
How would you describe communications between yourselves as parents and the hospital throughout that period when the boys were on the unit?
During the day when we were actually on the unit, it was where the nurses in the room with us were very good at communicating and explaining things. It was when we were not on the unit or overnight that the communication wasn't there, and there was a few times where we would phone the unit and say, "How's this gone?" or "How's this been?" But other than that, there wasn't any.
And reflecting on your experiences during the 31 days that the twins are in the neonatal unit, how did these rules and restrictions around visiting in particular, how did that make you feel as parents?
We didn't feel like we were being treated like parents. It was more like a visit. We were visitors. We were visiting. It didn't. Although we were their parents, it didn't feel like we were their parents because we weren't being treated like that, and that was down to the rules because the restrictions were on visiting rather than on parents.
And did you feel that the rules made any allowance or took into account the fact that these were twins, this was a multiple birth?
No.
Or indeed the fact that you had another child at home?
No.
What you've said in your witness statement is this. We needed for the hospital to understand that we're a family and these are our children. We didn't feel that we were going to see our children. We felt we were going to see patients. We didn't feel like a mother and father to the children in the way that we should have done. Does that sum up your feelings about that time?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mullen. I've no more questions for you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Mann. I hope it wasn't too distressing for you. How are your daughter and the boys doing?
Really well, thank you. Yeah, really good.
And how's your daughter coping with two horrors of 4-year-old?
Really well, actually. Yeah, she has her moments, but she's quite motherly to them. She can be very protective, which I can very much understand. Bless her. So yeah, very, very good. Thank you.
Well, you've obviously got your hands full, so thank you very much for coming along to help us.
Thank you.
My lady, may I call Jenny Ward? She will affirm.
I do
Thank you, Sandra. Sorry.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Ms Ward. You should have your statement in front of you, and that is INQ 3040856. Ms Ward, you're here today as Chief Executive of the Lullaby Trust and also Chair of the Pregnancy and Baby Charities Network, is that right?
Yes, that is.
And your evidence today is on behalf of the 13 pregnancy, baby and parent organisations, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And if you don't mind, I will refer to them as the PBPOs from here on in. You've set out the members of the PBPOs in full in your statement, but can you give us an example of some of the organisations within that group?
Yes, absolutely. So of the 13, just to reiterate, although we tend to talk about maternity and neonatal, we cover a wide range of that whole period, and it can be divided into early pregnancy, antenatal, postnatal and neonatal. So we have a number of organisations such as the Ectopic Pregnancy Trust that cover, and the Miscarriage Association that cover early pregnancy, and then those of us like the Lullaby Trust, like Tommy's, who cover the period of birth and postnatal, and then neonatal is covered again by Tommy's and by Bliss. So there's a wide range of organisations.
Thank you. And it's right that there's representation across the UK.
Yes, that's correct.
We're going to go essentially through the impact of the pandemic on maternity services for pregnant women throughout kind of the maternity journey, starting with antenatal services. The guidance at the start of the pandemic was for antenatal services to be maintained with a minimum of 6 face-to-face antenatal consultations, with video and remote consultations as an alternative. Now, in your experience, was that guidance followed throughout the pandemic?
I think there was a mixed experience there. And when we look at some of those organisations that deal with early pregnancy, and there's reference to that there were families who, where they had concerns with their pregnancy, they weren't able to access the face-to-face or even an online appointment that they needed to. So I think it was very much a mixed picture.
And can you just set out for us some examples of the potential impact and risks of those appointments or services being missed in the early stages?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some conditions in pregnancy that can only be picked up by being seen face-to-face and having specific tests for that. So not being able to access that, or families being concerned about going somewhere face-to-face would have had an impact potentially on their health of not being able to do that. And there is, of course, the other side of families being particularly worried because in those early weeks we were all told to stay at home. So having a concern, and as organisations and as healthcare professionals, we all encourage people to go and seek support if they're worried. In that period, I think it was harder to get that support, and it was also more likely that people would shy away from going out proactively.
And I think you've given quite a few examples in your statement of experiences that parents and also healthcare professionals had with an increased use of online and remote access to maternity services. And you've set out some there, but were there some, could you perhaps provide us with some of the positives and negatives of an increased use of those online options?
Yes, absolutely. They weren't all negative. So there are some good examples of practice of appointments being far more accessible by being online, and that's good. Some of the parts that might be, and also, for example, if you had pregnancy sickness, the thought that you had to go face-to-face somewhere was practically very difficult to do. So it was good that there was an online option. Some of the negative parts of that, as I said, there are specific tests and specific concerns that people would raise face-to-face that maybe they felt they wouldn't on
on an online appointment. And also there were some people who just simply didn't have the ability there to use an online system and to contact their health professional. So where we talk about the inequalities that are there, digital poverty definitely meant that those who were less able to access that were more negatively impacted.
And I think you've given some examples in your statement of pregnant women delaying access to care and telephone. They're examples of telephone triage. So if we could go to INQ 30408-656, page 11. And if we look at questions 1 and questions 2, is it right that this is feedback from various organisations within 13 PBPOs that you've included within your statement, and we're going to go to a few of those throughout the morning?
Yes, absolutely. So of the 13 organisations, we all work closely with the people that we support. So they come and talk to us, and we've gone and asked them what could be improved. So these are those people who work closely with us directly coming with those comments.
So the first comment there is that it was really only because I was worried about COVID in the hospitals that I didn't go to A&E. And then the second, a day passed and I started feeling dizzy. The pain had got worse, reluctant to go to A&E in the current pandemic. I knew something was not right. And then the third one there relates to problems getting an appointment with a doctor. So they said my severe pain went from possible appendicitis to pelvic inflammatory disease. This was by telephone consultations, and 3 weeks after the pain had started, I was finally told I had an ectopic pregnancy and my tube had completely ruptured. So the reasons that we see there, are they the same or similar to the experiences that PBPOs heard during the pandemic as to why women weren't accessing healthcare or delayed doing so?
They give a really good representation of the messages that we got, which was people pulling back, thinking, well, I've been told to stay at home. We've also been told that healthcare places like hospitals are overwhelmed. We're also worried about COVID. We've been told that in pregnancy we're particularly vulnerable. And as I said, some of these conditions, the initial symptoms are not necessarily things that make you feel you absolutely need to go to A&E directly. So yes, people held back and yeah, there were difficult situations as a result of that.
And on the topic of telephone triage, in your statement, you've referred to guidance from the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology regarding telephone triage services when a woman makes a complaint or raises a concern. And essentially, there was rationalisation of services to look at when scans and visits are needed, either without delay or whether there could be a safe delay. Obviously, we see some of that in the third quotation here around a telephone consultation. Were PBPOs aware of cases where pregnant women who had concerns about their unborn baby and were feeling unwell, they were given stay-at-home advice where they may have, in non-pandemic times, been asked to attend a face-to-face appointment or assessment?
Yes, I think there's a mixed picture there, and actually there is some good examples where having that telephone triage was helpful to families to give them some reassurance. It was helpful to health professionals who, as we heard it in this particular area, were already overstretched, so they could really look and decide who it was where they had to make a choice. So yes, there are some benefits to that, but yes, we did hear that there were also negatives.
And did you hear about those continuing throughout the pandemic?
In terms of having triage and...
Yes, those concerns that you've just mentioned, did they continue, or did you find that they kind of went in waves?
My understanding is that they continued throughout.
Thank you. In your statement, you've referred to a finding by Tommy's midwives who saw a 40% increase in email inquiries. between March and August 2020 for help and support, they say from a trusted source, which they believe was a consequence of women being discouraged from visiting hospital or antenatal services unless absolutely necessary. And you've said in your statement that Tommy's considers that women were being encouraged to miscarry at home. Was help and support available other than from the charitable organisations?
I think, again, that was a mixed picture. So usually if a woman is worried about miscarriage, they could contact a health professional and they could then get checked, and they would, if that was confirmed that's the case, they would be given options on what to do. In this circumstance, in this period, certainly of the early pandemic, it appears that women were encouraged to take what we would call a managed wait, which is basically stay at home and let nature take its course. That has a huge impact on families.
I want to stay on the topic of miscarriage and building on what you've just said. If we could go to another example from your statement, so INQ 30408-656, and it's number 8. Question 8 in the blue box. This is another experience that a woman had during the pandemic, where she said, I had a really drawn-out experience in which I had to go to multiple GP surgeries and hospitals to confirm my miscarriage as appointments were so scarce. I was dismissed by the doctor in A&E as being dramatic regarding spotting in my 8th week of pregnancy, and from there it took almost 3 weeks to diagnose a miscarriage, a further week for my treatment to be booked. As it was, I miscarried naturally on the day of my appointment at home, where I was scared and in pain. I rang the hospital and they simply told me to take paracetamol. I still have flashbacks and nightmares regarding this, even following the birth of my healthy child. Is that an example of what you've just given of a managed miscarriage?
Yes, it is.
And the Miscarriage Association carried out a survey during the first wave, during the first and second wave of the pandemic, of women that were affected by pregnancy loss, and found that most were able to access hospital care, but 10% were unable to be seen in person. And again, is that the impact of the use of more remote and virtual consultations that we've discussed?
Yes, it is. And I would also say it feels, from that quote and from the examples from the Miscarriage Association, as if miscarriage was downplayed, like it's something that happens, so that's just kind of that's what happens, keep on with it, and it wasn't prioritised.
And also in your statement, if we could go to page 18 please, and questions 11 and 12, or Q11 and 12 at the top of the page, thank you. This relates to surgery for miscarriage, so the in-hospital care and access to treatment. So the first, number 11, is I was left in pain for hours with no pain relief, unable to have surgery due to COVID-19, and my miscarriage was manually removed. It had a big impact on how I've been feeling over the last 3 years. And then in the second one, it was she said that I ended up waiting 3 days in hospital for surgery, 4 weeks after finding out I had a miscarriage, and I was told surgery was not an option originally due to COVID, and ended up with an infection. Were PBPOs aware of the impact of COVID on access to in-hospital treatment for miscarriage? For example, surgery that we've seen here, keyhole surgery during the pandemic.
Yes, and we fight hard to make sure that families, and have over the years, get a choice in the treatment, particularly when it relates to a miscarriage or the loss of a pregnancy or a baby. So it was particularly distressing for us to hear that was taken away from families. And as these say, it has an impact on them for a very long time.
Moving on then to birth and to labour. So can you briefly summarise the birthing options available to a woman outside of the pandemic?
Yes, usually you would have the choice to either give birth in a hospital setting, consultant-led, in a midwifery-led centre, or in a birthing centre, which is kind of separate from a hospital, or at home, which would have maternity staff there. We would have midwives, and they usually specialise in home births. So those are the options.
And you've described in your statement how the choice of birth setting is, in normal situations, a key part of maternity policy to enable women autonomy and control over a safe birthing event. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And we'll come on to specific examples, but overall, did that happen during the pandemic?
No, those choices were decreased immediately the pandemic started.
And in your statement, you've set out some findings from a survey that the Royal College of Midwives undertook. A survey that they undertook in regard to closures. And we're going to come on to address that in more detail with the Royal College. But you have set out in your statement some of the impact of those closures that we can see from pregnant women that have provided those quotations. So if we could go to INQ 30408-656, page 25, please. At the top. And one respondent said that in my birth plan, I'd requested a water birth and an active birth. It was not possible. And again, no midwife explained why I couldn't do this or even appeared to acknowledge my birth plan. And then at page 33, number 30, here somebody said, due to midwife shortages, my baby was delivered at the side of the road. The ambulance crew told us that we were the second couple they had been to that night who had delivered en route to the hospital. Dealing first with the first example we looked at, was there a lack of information or explanation as to why options were limited during the pandemic?
Yes, I think that's true. I think families certainly felt that their choice wasn't there and they didn't fully understand why. But at that time, we all understood the pressures that were under the health system. And I think a lot of families just kind of accepted, OK, that would have been my choice, but unfortunately it's not there. And, you know, we've been told we're all in this together and I kind of need to accept that.
And could you explain briefly what free births are and whether PBPOs saw any increase in free births and what the risks of them are as well?
Yeah, my understanding of a free birth is somebody who gives birth without any medical care there. We did hear of them being more likely to happen during this period for several reasons. Firstly, that, as I said, the teams that would normally support families to have a home birth in their own setting had been redeployed elsewhere, and that wasn't something that was offered. But also families who felt that going into a hospital was a risk for them and their baby, and felt that their choice to mitigate that risk was to give birth at home, even if that meant they were on their own.
And dealing with that second quotation around staff shortages, is that something that PBPOs heard impacted on the care and the services that were available to pregnant women during the pandemic when it came to birthing options?
Yes, absolutely.
We've touched briefly on pain relief and pain management with the water birth there. You have set out at paragraph 81 of your statement findings from a survey of 1,200 people who had given birth from August 2021 to July 2022. And that showed that 39% had to wait over 30 minutes for pain relief during labour. And 35% had reported delays and staff noticing or acting on signs they had or might have had a serious health problem. There was guidance from the Royal College of Midwives on access to water births, but was it PBPO's experience that there were delays or suspensions of pain relief, for example, water births or epidurals during the pandemic?
I think this survey seemed to suggest that, yes, that was. So those figures are higher than the ones that were found pre-pandemic. And that is exactly the result that we would expect to have heard from what we heard about staff shortages and what was going on in units. And as we said, if the other options for places to give birth had been closed and weren't available, you would expect that those consultant-led units were even busier at a time when they had even greater staff shortages than they did prior to the pandemic.
Moving on to maternal mortality and inequalities. At paragraph 45 to 49 of your statement, you've summarised the findings from 2 reports by Embrace, that's MBRAACE, and they found that improvements in care may have made a difference for 7 in 10 women who died with COVID-19 whilst pregnant or in the immediate post-pregnancy period. And they later updated that to 7.6 in 10 women. What were PBPO's views on the findings?
I think, well, they're devastating, aren't they? That there could have been a different outcome. I think we know that there are lots of inquiries going on into maternity safety in terms of inequalities, that they have been there for a long time. And in this period, we knew that the groups that were at risk prior to the pandemic were even more at risk now. And this is the upshot, unfortunately, that those groups were even more impacted. So yeah, devastated. Lots of things that we would like to change and that we're all working hard and engaging with to try and change those figures. Those are not figures any of us want to see.
And I think in your statement, you've set out some steps that could and should have been taken during the pandemic to address pregnant women's fears and concerns about accessing medical support and the practical barriers to doing so. Could you summarise some of those practical steps that could have been taken and should have been taken?
Yeah, I think there was a very strong stay-at-home messaging and very strong messaging around pregnancy being a vulnerable group. And I think that actually going out to those people and saying, but your care, that doesn't count for your care, should have been a really strong message. And one of the themes that we've come out with is the engagement of us as 13 organisations. And as a wider network, there are 31 charities who are in the Pregnancy and Baby Charity Network, so not within this group. We all work directly with families. We're all used to getting messages out there. We're trusted organisations to them, and we could have worked on that much more clear and made sure that families weren't staying at home when they really needed to get out.
You've also summarised the findings from another report from Embrace, which found that there remains an almost 4-fold difference in maternity mortality rates amongst women from Black ethnic backgrounds and 2-fold difference amongst women from Asian ethnic backgrounds compared to white women, and that women from the most deprived areas have twice as high mortality rates as those in least deprived areas. Again, what were PBO's views on those findings and the experiences that they heard? Did they mirror those findings?
Yes, I would say, as I mentioned, we all know that they're at high-risk groups. They're groups that we all target, and there are specific groups who are led by people within those communities. So if you've heard of an organisation called 5 Times More, they exist because of that inequality. So I think, yes, we are shocked, but sadly not surprised that those inequalities remain. I would certainly hope that they should have been a high-risk group from the very beginning that everybody tried to focus on. Unfortunately, as it transpired, they were also a high-risk group for COVID. So you had the two challenges really coming together here. And I think we would have hoped the communications around that would have recognised that in a bit more detail than possibly they did.
There was guidance from the Royal College of Midwives, and NHS England also announced additional support for pregnant ethnic minority women. Does PBPOs have any views as to whether that additional support and advice was in fact effective?
I think looking at the guidance, and I know you have heard from other professionals as well, that there was a lot of guidance that came out. It was continually updated. Trying to stay on top of that and to translate it into practice on the ground when they are completely overstretched is really difficult for professionals to do. So from our perspective, it may have been recognised there, but the communications to people on the ground weren't as effective as they could have been.
Moving on to the topic of visiting restrictions, first of all, in antenatal settings. So there was, as we've heard in this inquiry, a suspension on hospital visiting from the end of March 2020, and one of the there wasn't a permitted exception for women to be accompanied at a scan or early pregnancy appointment. We've got some examples in your statement of the impact that had. So if we could have one of those up, please, INQ 30408-656, and it's number 62. Thank you. This responder said, I had a routine scan which my husband couldn't attend, but the reason it affects me now still is because I later lost my baby. She was born at 20 weeks, but I had a missed second trimester miscarriage as she passed at 16 weeks. My husband never got to see her alive as he wasn't at that first scan. Now, of course, all of those that were impacted during the pandemic will have been impacted in different ways, but you've said that in PBPO's experience, the restrictions had a particularly negative impact on those receiving bad news. Is that right?
Yes, that is.
And again, the Miscarriage Association survey found that 77% could not take anyone with them to an in-hospital appointment during the early stages of the pandemic, and 25%, under 25% were able to make a call or video during that appointment.
Yeah.
And is that reflective of the impact and the experiences that PBPO heard from its members of the restrictions on attendance at antenatal scans during the pandemic?
Yes, that's correct.
In your statement, you've set out the changes, or some of the changes, to the approach in the guidance in the summer of 2020. So I think you've said that Scotland were the first to define the circumstances in which maternity and neonatal services could reduce the level of restrictions, and then Northern Ireland followed shortly. Just dealing with those two first, what was the response of the PBPOs to those changes in the guidance, and did that lead to some more consistency in the implementation of the guidance in the units?
I think for us as UK organisations, trying to stay on top of guidance that was changing quite across the board, changing fairly frequently in some areas, was tricky. To know that was different depending on what country, which part of the UK you were in, was particularly hard. So families picked that up. They knew, well, I know somebody who is in here and they're allowed to do that. Why am I not? And we didn't have the answers for them to be able to say that. Usually we would hope that we could reassure families and say, you should be allowed your partner at this point, and we simply couldn't do that. These were, of course, still guidance, and the practical setup of units meant that it had to be guidance. We accept that, and they needed to know the arrangements within their own unit and what they could facilitate. But we just saw a lot of discrepancy. It was, as I said, it was guidance. It wasn't something that came into, was actually practically there for quite a long time. And after that, of course, we faced future waves of COVID, and that meant that we saw units pulling back again and going back to the more restrictive policies.
Yes, I was going to come on to guidance that followed later in September 2020 from NHS England, where they developed a visiting framework encouraging local risk assessments and providing for birth partners, visitors in labour and birth settings, and that included the antenatal and postnatal wards and scans, and that they should be deemed essential visitors at that stage. And then there's further guidance from NHS England in December 2020, so right at the beginning of the second wave, which set out that women should be supported by another person throughout the pregnancy journey, and including at scans when it was important to the woman. So did PBPOs have any views on the timing of that guidance, and again, whether in fact it did lead to any changes on the ground?
That's a long time to come out from the first lockdown that we saw in March to December. And even then it was guidance, and it still refers to birth partners as visitors and those coming into the scan partners as visitors, and we strongly believe that's not the case. So yes, it was too long in coming out, too long in being implemented locally, and for staff on the ground to be supported to understand how they could allow people to come in. But essentially, yes, it's still referred to birthing partners as and neonatal parents as visitors, and that's not a line that we think has been helpful to families. It's been hugely damaging.
And then finally, just dealing with Wales, which again you addressed in your statement, it's right that they didn't update their guidance to reflect birthing partners and supporters at appointments as essential visitors until May 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Moving on to birthing partners during labour. So this was one of the exception to the restrictions on visitors to hospital from the early part of the pandemic in the guidance. In Wales, there was a difference in that the woman in labour should be permitted a birthing partner from their household. Did PBPOs receive any feedback on the difference in that Welsh guidance that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of specific differences in Wales that we were fed back.
And to your knowledge, was that guidance with that exception implemented across the UK?
No, we continue to hear stories going into 2021 where there were differences between different hospitals and units on birthing partners and when and if they were allowed in.
And again, reflective of the changes that we've just discussed in relation to antenatal services, there was also changes to the visiting guidance for labour and birth throughout summer of 2020, wasn't there?
Yeah.
In respect of visiting guidance, did the PBPOs hear concerns about women only being allowed a birthing partner during active labour and any inconsistencies in the interpretation of active labour?
Yes, absolutely. Having a birthing partner there and what you define as active labour is something that is open to debate. And we understand as well that, as I said, units were very stretched. So if you were in a labour ward, for most women who are in labour are in a private room by themselves. So if they are not allowed their birthing partner in until they are deemed to be at a certain point of labour, they're on their own in that room, and that's frightening. So actually to sit there and to think, well, I have to be at a certain stage in order to get support is particularly tricky. And I also want to make the point that impacts on the staff who are on that unit as well. They don't have somebody else to support women, to advocate for them, to say she doesn't look right or she seems to be in extreme pain, all the things that birthing partners have discussed and are ready to do. So it actually had an even greater impact on staff of not being able to have them there until they were deemed to be in active labour.
Were you aware of reports indicating that some women felt obliged to undergo vaginal examinations to prove that they were in active labour so that partners could enter the room?
We've seen those reports, yes. And although I couldn't tell you how often that happened, I think from understanding how women felt during that period, if they felt, as I said, alone and scared and in a room where they're largely by themselves and they don't want to bother the staff that are really busy, I think it's completely understandable if they felt that examination might be the access for them to get more help, that they, even without a medical reason being needed for that, I think we can understand why some people may have consented to that.
So I'm not following this line of argument. Wouldn't you, if you were in labour, be subject to vaginal examinations anyway to check how far along you were?
Yes, I think in this respect, it wasn't for a medical reason they were checking. It was purely so that they could decide whether the partner was allowed in or not.
Taking all of that into account then, is it your view that active labour should have been and in future should be defined in guidance?
I think that would be helpful for staff there. And I would say we did get some really good feedback from families who had staff who were aware of how difficult it was to be on their own, sometimes said, I'm going to let them in, or in some instances letting them in a fire escape so that they weren't, subject to the usual entrance into the unit. So I think, there was an understanding of how difficult that was to be by themselves until that point.
And dealing then with visiting guidance for postnatal wards. It's right, isn't it, that again, that this was quite varied across the UK, not only in the guidance, but also implementation actually on the ground. In your statement, there are examples as to the impact of those restrictions. So if we could turn please to INQ 30408-656, page 41. Thank you. So 2 examples here. The first being that not being able to be on the ward together was so hard and definitely had an impact on our ability to gel as a family. This was our first baby. I felt bad for my husband for every moment I was on the ward and not him. It had a major impact on breastfeeding, which in turn had an impact on my baby's care and length of stay in hospital. And then secondly, I felt like I wasn't her mum, like someone else was raising my baby, like me and her dad weren't important enough to be there. All of the firsts I should have been able to do with my baby were taken away from me. Again, is that reflective of some of the experiences from PBPO members of the restrictions on attendance at postnatal wards?
Yes, it is. And just to reiterate there that where it was, where they were classed as visitors, and as I said, that's not a term that we think should have been in place. Actually, most of the impact was on partners, and most of those were dads.
Thank you. My lady, my next topic is still on visiting restrictions, but neonatal units. So it may be just a moment to take our mid-morning break.
Very well. I hope you were warned, Ms. Waller, you probably know anyway from following our proceedings, at 5-2.
Thank you.
All rise.
Hands.
Thank you. Ms Ward, just one more question before I move on to neonatal units. You've said a few times this morning that it's the view of PBPOs that parents should not be considered visitors in the guidance. Can you just say why that is?
In relation to neonatal
Units that aren't neonatal units. We'll come on to neonatal.
So in terms of birthing partners, are you specifically asking?
Yes, yeah, and in antenatal periods as well.
Because the care appears to be around the person who's receiving the medical care, so in most instances it will be a pregnant woman, we very much reiterate that this is an impact on both partners there. So where there is also the partner is the dad, that decisions, that bad news or even update news, any kind of news directly impacts them as well. And that's why they should be a part of that. So just for example, to think about if you were to have a scan in early pregnancy and as a woman you're there on your own, you're given bad news as a result of that, you may then be given treatment options or options that could impact your future fertility and certainly have an impact on how you are going to manage the difficult news that you've had. And we heard stories of women having to do that by themselves or then having to go out and explain that to their partner who'd been waiting in a car, which is incredibly difficult.
And is it also right that in terms of during labour and birth and also in postnatal wards as well, they can provide a caring role?
Absolutely. There's multiple elements to why it's important that they're there. It's caring both for the mother, for the baby, being the support, the advocacy, and trying to understand the advice that they had. So if you are given medical advice from somebody in a difficult period or in a traumatic period, it's very difficult to take that in. And the role of your partner there is often to have a bit more understanding of that and to ask questions that maybe you wouldn't be able to.
Thank you. So moving on then to neonatal units. So one of the exceptions in the national restrictions on visiting was for one parent to visit a child. We heard this morning impact evidence of restrictions on neonatal units. Is that reflective of the experiences that PBPO members had?
Yes, it is.
And in your statement, you've described attempts by PBPOs and the Royal Colleges during the summer of 2020 for there to be unrestricted parent access to neonatal units, but that they were met with resistance. Can you explain what that resistance was and who that was from?
Just to reiterate, that's from mainly that advice comes from BLISS, who are the neonatal charity, and they worked closely with BAPAM, who are the British Association of Perinatal Medicine, and RCPCH, Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, and they were all very supportive of those restrictions being relaxed in that setting. I believe that the resistance to that was around opening up again infection risks for COVID. I don't think it took into account the impact that those organisations were very strongly putting across that was having, both on the parents and also on the babies themselves, who for a lot of the time were in a unit not being cared for in the way that they would usually be. So just to state, in case people aren't aware, that usually parents have 24/7 unrestricted access to a baby in a neonatal unit. The other thing that they do with that unrestricted access, and quite often if they're able to, parents will spend as much time as they can with their babies. They are a very integral part of their care, and they're encouraged to be. So they will be, for example, where possible, changing the baby's nappy and supporting staff in that. So they would, if you're looking at your individual baby, you're much more likely to be able to say, they look a bit different here. They seem to be a bit more uncomfortable. They're a bit more fractious, and then staff can step in. So the impact on staff of not having parents there was also going to be an increased workload.
Who would have been the on high for a neonatal unit to impose what seemed to have been rigid visiting restrictions?
I believe it was that guidance that you've referred to, and then individual hospitals or trusts would have to make that decision. We certainly heard hospitals that were, from a birthing partner perspective, close geographically, but had very different policies. So it didn't appear, the consistency didn't appear to be there. And there were certainly families in neonatal settings, depending on the care that your baby needed, you may well end up with that baby having care between units. And then from families changing from one unit to another and seeing a difference in the access that they had was also difficult.
Thank you. And as far as you're aware, what were some of the barriers to implementing more relaxed restrictions on visiting in neonatal units?
I think the physical space that they had was probably a concern. So if your baby is in a separate room compared to in one room where there may be up to 8 cots and staff looking after those, you could see that 8 families potentially coming and going would be a concern. I think it's one that could be mitigated, and it could be considered how you reduce that, and lots of different things that we could take into account here as time went on, whether that's PPE, whether that's testing. But as Tamsin said this morning, where even when they're in a private room, it seemed like at some stages that wasn't anything that was taken into account and any changes that were made. In a unit typically as well, you would have not just the room that the babies that are in, but you would have a feeding, expressing room. You would have a kitchen and other areas where families are supported, as I said, because they are there 24/7. They have additional support to allow them to be there. That also gave them the ability to cross over with other families, and our experience is that those additional rooms were closed as infection risks.
And you've referred in your statement to the situation in Wales. And you've said that Bliss met with the Welsh Government in the summer and autumn of 2021 because the guidance was that one parent could be present at a time. What was the intention of those meetings, and when, or if and when, did that lead to any changes in the guidance?
I think I would refer, that's Bliss, so I wasn't a part of those meetings, but my understanding is that they were certainly hoping that those restrictions would be reduced, given that there's guidance in place. I think it took longer than that to actually see that and to hear from families that a more ideal situation was taking place.
I think you said in your statement that it wasn't until May 2022 that in fact those changes were made. And then in England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, in fact, it was in April 2022 that the guidance was for unrestricted visiting in neonatal units.
Yeah, I knew it was much later than we all might have presumed that the COVID period had an impact. It was actually, several years on.
And in general, what were the issues of parents being considered visitors on neonatal units? And again, do you think they should have been?
No, we don't think they should have been. I would say in those early few months then, yes, when we were trying to understand how the pandemic and how infection worked, and knowing that babies are particularly vulnerable, it was a huge concern for everybody. So caution in those early months is completely understandable. The impact that had on families and babies is significant, and you have obviously had an impact witness who has given you an idea of an individual family of the impact that had. As I said, that also had an impact on babies themselves. Those early few weeks, you get to know your baby. You get to see they change very rapidly, and one of the worries that families with a baby in a neonatal unit have with separation, even in normal times, is will I still be able to recognise my baby? They may have masks on them, they may have breathing equipment. If you're only able to see them for 1 or 2 hours a day, that's exacerbating the trauma that neonatal parents go through anyway.
Thank you. There were some initiatives that were introduced to try and promote contact where it couldn't be in person. For example, video calls in England and in Scotland. There was funding for taxi fares for parents to be able to travel to the hospital where they may be travelling more often than they would have otherwise done, and perhaps further. Do you have any feedback on those initiatives and whether they were successful, and whether there could be recommendations for further initiatives in the future?
My understanding is that we certainly did support those, and it recognised the difficult situation that families were in. So just Tamsin was talking about that it was a 1.5 hour round trip, I believe. That's not uncommon for families to have to go through. And obviously in this period where you've got other children, it's very difficult. And again, we wouldn't want the access and the support that parents have to be negatively impacted for any financial reason. I think we would certainly need to look at studies and actually have an evidence base for how we best support families to have the maximum access to their baby that they can. And if that involves more funding, then absolutely we'd support that.
And in terms of those initiatives and the guidance in general, was there any consultation with the PBPOs during the development of that guidance, or any feedback sought in terms of the implementation and the impact it was having throughout the pandemic?
I do not believe so, but I'm aware that there was much impact, much feedback from Bliss and from other organisations to try and get that guidance changed.
In relation to access to PPE and COVID-19 testing to facilitate visiting, it's not until the end of 2020 that in some of the UK, the national guidance included use of LFTs to facilitate visiting. Were you aware of any issues related to access to suitable PPE or COVID testing for pregnant women and their partners or family members to attend to visit them in hospital?
We haven't done a study to look into the actual impact of that. However, there have certainly been concerns about whether the difficulties in accessing both of those things meant that the visitor restrictions were not relaxed as quickly as they might have been if that was more readily available.
And does the PBPO have any views as to whether increased use of PPE and COVID-19 testing in future should be available in order to facilitate visiting?
Yes, it absolutely should. The one impact that I would think about is how you use PPE. So if you are, and I know you've already had another impact witness whose baby was sadly at end of life care, and she reiterated that they still had to use PPE even knowing that. So I think actually understanding where that fits in and where those, having more specific guidance to allow that, because that shouldn't have been the case. It's a tragic situation there.
Were PBPO made aware of communication issues with the use of PPE?
Yes, absolutely. And specifically in groups that we would class as vulnerable. So people who were maybe had difficulties with particular access, whether that's speaking another language or having issues with hearing, they found that particularly difficult. So there is a national bereavement care pathway that covers all types of pregnancy and baby loss, and that very much reiterates across those that, and it's accepted by just about every trust in the country, that communication is absolutely key, and understanding how somebody is comprehending the news that you're giving them is very much, being able to see them is very much aids you to know, if as a professional, whether you need to give them more support in that messaging.
Were you aware of any training for healthcare professionals to facilitate that kind of communication with use of PPE?
I'm not aware of any, no.
Thank you. You have touched upon in your statement support for healthcare workers in implementing the guidance and whether there was any support available. Could you just explain that a little bit more and what the PBPO's experience of that was?
Which guidance are you referring to?
So it's at paragraph 47 of your statement.
I think in general this is around guidance to try and encourage people to come into units and hospitals. I think in general we certainly, some of my colleagues in the other organisations heard from health professionals who were asking them to help to work out what the guidance meant and how they could implement it. I think in this particular time, it feels like training was not something that was prioritised. So we certainly found professionals who felt there was a lot of guidance coming out, and they were trying to work through how they did that. So certainly one of the things that we reiterate is giving support to professionals in understanding what the guidance is and why it's in place.
Thank you. Moving on to a different topic, and that's the categorisation of pregnant women as clinically vulnerable. Now, you've not addressed this in your statement, but I wanted to ask you whether PBPOs were aware of any issues or concerns about that decision to include pregnant women in the CV category, and also whether there was sufficient information available, particularly early on, and advice about what that meant in practice.
Most of us support families directly, so getting that message that you're clinically vulnerable is very difficult for people to get. And at the stage that was announced in March 2020, none of us really understood enough about COVID. So trying to support people who, in general, were extremely worried by that. And as I said, we were all told to stay at home, and adding in that you were also vulnerable to COVID meant there were people who had appointments. Sometimes they were moved to a digital means, and sometimes they were told you still need to come in for a scan, and that was a huge worry for people as well. So I think that had a significant impact on that group and the support that they sought and their willingness to go into hospital and other settings as well, GP surgeries as well. Most of those were closed off, so going in and saying, right, you've got a midwife appointment, we want to check your blood pressure. People were having to weigh up for themselves whether they felt that was a risk that they were willing to take, which is a difficult position to be in. So I think you referred earlier to Tommy's, who had an increased number of calls. I would say that most of us as charities kept our methods of contact, our support helplines, emails, etc. open, and we all saw big increases. And they were people that were isolated and scared and worried and wanting to talk to somebody about this.
Thank you. That brings me on to my next topic, actually, in regard to the impact on mental health. What impact did PBPO see on the mental health of pregnant women, both during the antenatal and postnatal period?
I think it's very clear that we saw people who were extremely worried. So this period of antenatal and postnatal is a period where particularly maternal mental health is a particular focus, and the professionals who would support, identify and be able to give some advice to people weren't as readily available. You add into that as well that your usual support mechanisms are taken away, and we all had an increased general level of anxiety. It was a very difficult period. So these were times when, yes, we were worried about the families that we supported. From the Lullaby Trust, we give out, the majority of the advice we give out is about safer sleep for babies. We found our calls were much longer, and they had a wide range of topics because they were people who just wanted to talk to somebody, and we're not medically trained, so we can't give that advice. But actually what they were looking for was somebody to listen to them. So I think all the things together, all those elements made it really tricky for families in this period. And I know there is research that shows that maternal mental health was impacted by that.
And there was a move to providing antenatal classes and education online. Is that something that was effective? And again, were there any access issues that you were aware of? Sorry.
Yeah, so one of our 13 organisations is NCT, the National Childbirth Trust. They're known for giving antenatal classes. Prior to the COVID pandemic, they were all face-to-face. They then had to move those and moved as many as they could online, and they had a good coverage of that. Although the satisfaction rate from that was still high, it was less than the face-to-face ones. And my understanding is that most of the classes they run today are back to being face-to-face. And I'd again reiterate that there are access issues, particularly with digital poverty, that we'd be very concerned about. But actually the support networks were gone. So having a call where you have maybe 8 people joining there, you can't have a chat with them in the same way as you would while you're having, while you're getting a cup of tea. And those are the things that really impacted on people's mental health and their confidence in parenting.
I want to ask you some questions about health visiting. Again, this isn't addressed in your statement, but I believe you have received the statement that we've received from the Institute of Health Visiting. For context, from the 20th of March 2020, the NHS England guidance was that health visitors should be considered for redeployment to the front line, and essentially that the health visiting should be stopped and provided only as a partial service, offering antenatal contact and new baby visits only. And face-to-face only if there was a compelling need and with PPE. The Institute of Health Visiting described this as a profound mistake. and that partial stop and redeployment remained in England until the 3rd of June 2020. Before asking you about the impact of those decisions, can you just explain to us a little bit about the importance of health visiting services throughout the pregnancy journey?
Yeah, of course. A health visitor is a specialist public health nurse. They work directly with families, often the most vulnerable. So a lot of their time will be spent with those families, and they could have hundreds of families that they look after individually. They will focus on those that they know to be the most vulnerable. So they often go directly out to those families in the early weeks after a baby's born and through up to the baby's about 2 or 3, maybe, something like that. They have more regular contact. They would also have contact through something like a baby clinic. So somebody could go in proactively and say, can you weigh my baby? So they do general checks. They do general checks of the family and of the baby, but they're also there as somebody to listen to, and they do have a safeguarding role to play in that as well. So yeah, that's what health visitors are there for.
And were any of the PBPOs made aware of issues or concerns caused by the change in service provision during the pandemic?
Yes, from our perspective in the Lullaby Trust, we work closely with health visitors. They're one of the key areas that safe sleep advice goes out. They also run a programme that we run called Connie, which is Care of Next Infant. So that's more intensive health visiting for people who have had a baby die suddenly and unexpectedly previously. And it was those health visitors who were trained in the Connie programme who called us immediately. This is the first way that we were aware, saying, I'm being redeployed, there is nobody to look after my families. Are you going to be there? Can I refer them to you because I'm really worried about them? And we did manage to stay open. Usually we would offer support through health visitors for Connie families. But in this respect, we said give them our contact details. So health visitors were the ones that contacted us worried about the families that they were being redeployed and leaving behind.
And obviously, as a charitable organisation, you wouldn't have been able to help everybody. Were you aware of examples where the health visitors were redeployed and there wasn't anybody to look after those families?
Yeah, we certainly heard from families in that situation. And there are some practical elements to this programme, to health visiting, as I said, in terms of like weighing a baby, for example, answering questions on feeding. But when you're sitting there with somebody, families tend to open up a bit more. And in the Care of Next Infant programme, where we've evaluated it in the past, the part that families always say is the most important part isn't the monitor that they're given or the guidance or the extra equipment. It's actually somebody to listen to them. So I think actually that is a really significant thing that we may not be able to measure, but it again increases that isolation that the most vulnerable felt.
And would the same level of care have been able to be provided through the use of online and remote consultations that you've just described?
No, not the same. And just to also reiterate that, I touched upon the safeguarding role that health visitors play and looking at the wider family setting. So, for example, thinking about mother's maternal health, but also going in and practically they might say things like, show me where your baby sleeps, or ask them how they're doing, or be aware of other issues that they might, by being in the home, be able to pick up. And that's a lot more difficult to do in a call.
And were you made aware of any issues with access to suitable PPE in order to carry out the visits that were deemed necessary?
Not in terms of PPE. What we did hear were health visitors who, when they were able, again, to go out and visit families, weighing babies on a doorstep. So the family having to pass the baby to the health visitor who weighed the baby outside and then handed them back again.
And as far as you're aware, had health visiting services been fully reinstated by the middle of 2022?
No, I think that we need more health visitors than we have already. And my understanding is that it's still not back in the place that it was prior to the pandemic.
a different topic. You've addressed in your statement at paragraph 49 the inclusion of pregnant women in medical trials and treatment programmes for COVID-19. Can you just elaborate on that, please?
Generally, I think it's right to say that even outside of COVID, pregnant women are not included in medical trials in the same way as other groups might be, and that was certainly the case for COVID-19.
And then the Department of Health and Social Care has told the inquiry that there was funding made available to Bliss, Tommy's and SANS organisations within PBPOs in April 2020 to provide bereavement support and to share the COVID-19 messaging to a wide audience. Did that funding have any positive impact on those two areas?
Absolutely. I can't reiterate enough the good work that the 13 organisations do. Any funding that was available in that time would have been put to good use, and I don't want to downplay the funding that was given, but it was given for a short period at a time when, as organisations, we were all receiving far more contacts and trying to give out messaging to people in completely new ways, whilst also being at home ourselves with those challenges. But for charities, we saw from March 2020 our incomes go off a cliff. So any funding was helpful, but the funding available there, yes, it didn't pick up the level of income that charities saw dropping. As I said, at the same time that our services were stretched to we had more calls than we'd ever had before.
Was there funding provided later on in the pandemic as well? You said it was short term, but was there further funding?
There was some through the National Lottery. There were other trusts and organisations who did an amazing job trying to offer emergency funding, but our incomes are not back to where they were pre-pandemic. I think that's across the board. That's fair to say. It's had a huge impact on all of us.
And in turn, has that had an impact on the service that can be provided?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
You've helpfully set out a number of lessons learnt and recommendations in your statement. Are there any that we have not covered that you wish to draw attention to today?
I think just the general issue is worth reiterating of the prioritisation that we believe should have been given to this area of healthcare. And I think it goes wide. It's visiting, it's funding, it's the impact longer term on babies, the impact on staff, the safeguarding issues around having contact with people in a very vulnerable part of their lives, but also in terms of bereavement as well. So all those areas, we would like to see that there. I think, we've touched on it quite a bit, but the communications are really, really key, and all of us work really hard. I think all my colleagues, when we're putting together advice, we use researchers and we use experts, and we also use the people who the advice needs to get out to. So using us as organisations, understanding the role of charities and voluntary organisations and the direct work they do, I think could have had a much better impact. Also supporting staff. So we did support staff as well, and we certainly realised the heavy impact on them and the lack of training that many of them had. So those are things that we would also like to reiterate. But yes, it was a very difficult period for everybody.
Thank you, Ms Ward. I don't have any further questions. My lady, do you have any questions?
No, I don't. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Ward. You are a superb advocate for the causes that you're representing. Thank you so much for your help. It's been extremely constructive and at times quite interesting. Things have moved on a bit since I gave birth. Thank you.
Thank you.
My lady, I understand that this afternoon's witness will be arriving shortly, so perhaps I may invite you to take an early lunch. I know it is quite early, but she will be arriving shortly for this afternoon's session.
And you'd obviously like to speak to her before?
I would, if possible, my lady.
Very well. If I return at 1:30?
Yes, I'm grateful.
Thank you.
All right.